So, welcome everybody at the last CPS Thursday session before holidays. For the introduction of today's seminar, I give word to our colleague from Institute of Philosophy, Dr. Petr Urban.
Thanks. So it's my great pleasure to present to you Dr. Robin Rollinger, who's currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Contemporary Continental Philosophy. And Robin Rollinger received his PhD in philosophy in Utrecht, in Holland. He wrote his PhD thesis with Karl Schumann there. Then he held research positions at the archives, Husserl archives in Freiburg and in Leuven. It was for a pretty long time, for 10 years together. And finally, for the last 5 years, he taught as an assistant professor at the University of Salzburg. His publications are focused mainly on Brentano school and on early phenomenology. He has published 4 books on these topics, and the last book on this topic is on philosophy of language and other matters in work of Anton Martin. And a very important book for me, I would say, and for the research in this field was his Husserl's position in the school of Brentano. Robin Rollinger edited 2 volumes of Husserliana. It was a volume on Transcendental Idealismus and volume 40 on the Husserl's theory of judgment. And the topic or the title of the present talk is Husserl's theory of judgment, from descriptive psychology to genetic phenomenology. So, Robin, the floor is yours.
Please, I have a question. Where is Professor born?
Where
Where?
is he born?
Yes.
Yeah, it was okay. So I think that you're
on the planet Earth. On the planet Earth. In the United States of America.
Second.
In the state of Kentucky. In the city of Covington. At St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Now I don't know the room exactly. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I see that there's a good turnout here on this very hot day. So I feel like it's my obligation to give you something of interest. I mean, you've come here on this really hot day to hear about Husserl, so I'll see what I can do. Now, I've chosen the topic of the theory of judgment. Of course, that has something to do with the fact that I edited a volume in the Husserliana on Husserl's theory of judgment, volume 40. But also because I think that it's an extremely important topic in Husserl's work. It's extremely important if you're just looking at Husserl's work immanently, because it's always there. It's there from very early on. Already in the 1890s, there are manuscripts on the theory of judgment. There's the logical investigations, of course, and one of the main features of the logical investigations, according to Husserl, was that it offered a theory of judgment which may not be fully satisfactory, but it was on the right path. Yes?
Excuse me. I have a problem with the word judgment. Because there is more meanings in Czech language. For example, judgment of God. Or it is a synonym of thinking.
Right, well, I'm
What
going to
is
be
the
more
judgment?
precise about that. I'm going to be more precise about that. The term in German, of course, is Urteil. And yes, it's...
Synonym in English.
Synonym is a synonym, that would be,
Thinking or not?
no, judgment. Urteil, the synonym of Urteil is judgment. Yeah, thinking, it's a kind of, it's certainly a kind of thinking, but you have, one has to be more precise about that, but I'll say at the outset here, that when we speak of judgment in Husserl, when Husserl speaks of an Urteil, he does mean a mental act of some kind. Now, sometimes other meanings come into play, and we'll talk about them more. But when he talks about Urteil, he primarily means Urteilen, judging. It's an act, it's a process that occurs in consciousness. Now a lot of philosophers nowadays don't really discuss judgment so much, but that was not at all the case in Husserl's time. Actually, in a work in logic at that time, you would find a theory of judgment. In logic, in psychology, in the theory of knowledge, you would always find a theory of judgment. Theory of judgment was a big deal. It was a big deal for Husserl, and it was a big deal for his contemporaries. He made an effort, I'll talk about that a little more, to actually bring together various manuscripts that he wrote on the theory of judgment, because he was constantly writing manuscripts, and a lot of them were on the theory of judgment, and he made an effort a couple of times to bring that all together and organize it into some coherent form. So it's a very important topic. The problem is most of his writings on the topic were left in manuscript, in these research manuscripts, Forschungsmanuskripte, that we find so many of in Husserl. And these are very difficult to read. They're not really meant, they were not meant for publication. They were Husserl's own attempt to solve problems, to formulate problems in the first place, to engage in certain thought experiments, and it's actually, it's where we can really see Husserl thinking. We really get a glimpse of Husserl's thought processes when we read his Forschungsmanuskripte, much more so than when we read his published books, his official statements. But these manuscripts are very, very difficult to interpret or to understand, because they, if Husserl makes a statement in them, you can't take that as his definitive statement. He's just trying something out. So you've got to be very cautious about that. Okay, so what I wanted to do is provide at least a framework in which his theory of judgment can be understood. It actually goes through different phases, and I want to present a three-phase framework. So the title of the seminar is Husserl's Theory of Judgment from Descriptive Psychology to Genetic Phenomenology. There you see 2 points, descriptive psychology, and then the end point is genetic phenomenology? Well, in between there's another phase. We could call it, you could call it various things. Let's just say it's the phenomenology of noematic correlates. I'll talk about that a bit more. Okay, so descriptive psychology is the first phase, and in the first edition of the Logical Investigations, Husserl says quite plainly that phenomenology is descriptive psychology. Now, of course, he changed that later on in the second edition, but at one time he was satisfied with that. And this notion of descriptive psychology he gets from his teacher, Franz Brentano. And Franz Brentano is of great interest here, not only because of his concept of descriptive psychology, but also because Brentano had offered a theory of judgment and considered this theory of judgment to be of great importance, of great consequence, not only within descriptive psychology itself, but also in logic. And Brentano actually presented a whole reform of logic on the basis of this theory of judgment. We can't really go into that, but I can say a few things about Brentano and his descriptive psychology. It's really necessary for understanding Husserl, I think. Descriptive psychology, according to Brentano, is it's contrasted with another branch of psychology, which he called genetic psychology, genetische Psychologie. And descriptive psychology is meant to describe mental phenomena, that is, to analyze them really in the sense of identifying their constituent parts, their elements, and to determine how they are combined in various ways. Genetic psychology, by contrast, is an attempt to explain mental phenomena, to explain them causally, and is to be connected in large measure with physiology. But Brentano spent most of his time on descriptive rather than genetic psychology. He thought genetic psychology could only be done in connection with physiology. He also thought it should be to some degree experimental, but in Vienna he could not get the funding that he needed to establish a psychological laboratory. But, like I said, he spent a good deal of his efforts on descriptive psychology. And in this descriptive psychology, we of course get his very famous intentionality thesis, where he defines a mental phenomena as a phenomenon which intentionally relates to an object, which has an intentional relation, intentionale Beziehung auf einen Gegenstand, to an object. But he also formulated this in another way and said that the object exists in consciousness. So he spoke of intentional in existence, which of course became very problematic. He also spoke of the object as an immanent object, as opposed to a real object. So there are cases where where there's consciousness of something, but that something does not exist in the real world. We can think of all kinds of things. We can think of unicorns, for example, which don't exist in the real world. And Brentano's early solution to that, to the problem that's thereby presented was, well, there's an immanent object, there's an intentional object. Maybe not a real one, but there's an immanent one, yes?
When Brentano lived, time.
Oh, the time frame. Brentano was born in, I believe, 1836. Or was it 1838? I believe it was 1836, and he died in 1917. Yeah, born in. He spent most of his childhood in Aschaffenburg. He was born somewhere near there, and his academic career was really spent only in two places, in Würzburg initially, but he, well, there's a whole story behind Brentano. If you want to know biographical, he was a priest, you know, he was a priest, and he was opposed to the doctrine of infallibility, so he left the priesthood in the Catholic Church, and
He was
therefore,
Frenchman.
what?
Frenchman?
No. He was, his family, of course, originally came from Italy, but they settled in Germany a couple of generations before Franz Brentano, the philosopher. His uncle was Clemens Brentano, or actually Clemens von Brentano. His aunt was Bettina von Arnim, two outstanding poets of the Romantic period in German literature. So he came from a very distinguished family. His brother also, Lujo Brentano, was a distinguished economist. But Franz Brentano was the philosopher. Husserl studied with Brentano in Vienna and was very impressed with this descriptive psychology. I guess I should have said that Husserl actually did study with Brentano. He attended his lectures. And so there's this intentionality in Brentano, this concept of intentionality. The other important thing to note about this descriptive psychology in Brentano is that he thought that you could classify mental phenomena on the basis of how the phenomenon intentionally relates to objects. He says that there are three ways that it can relate to objects. One way is to present the object, Vorstellung, to simply present it. As when we imagine something, but also in perception. I mean, perception for him is based on Vorstellung. Also, there are conceptual Vorstellungen, presentations. But the presentation in and of itself is neutral. It does not involve taking any kind of stand to the object. But then there's a second class of mental phenomena, according to Brentano, and that is judgment. And that involves taking a stance towards the object. Namely, this kind of stance to accept it or reject it. When we accept the object, we judge that it exists. When we reject it, we judge that the object does not exist. So we have our unicorn we just spoke of. You can merely present a unicorn. You can also judge that the unicorn doesn't exist, and then in that case, that's a rejection. But in this table, I accept that the table exists. That's a judgment that the table exists. Yes?
True and false. Yes.
Yeah, true and false. True and false comes into play with judgment. True and false comes in, not with Vorstellungen, not with presentations, but with judgment. And knowledge also. Knowledge comes into play with judgment.
So the law of tertium non datur. Yes or no in this situation?
The what?
Tertium non datur.
Oh, yes, 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 the law of the excluded middle. Yeah, exactly. Das ausgeschlossene Dritte. Yeah, it comes into play here in the sphere of judgment. The law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. Yes, absolutely. And that's why the theory of judgment is so important for logic. And then there is a third class of mental phenomena. We won't talk about them much more, but I have to say that just to complete the story of acts of loving and hating, and that involves taking a stance as well, but a different kind of stance. I mean, to love something or to hate it is not merely to think that it exists or it doesn't exist. And this third theory, this third class, is very important for ethics for Brentano. Actually, the first class, he says, the presentations are crucial to aesthetics. So really you have three branches of philosophy, what he would call practical philosophy, that are based on descriptive psychology. You have aesthetics based on the theory of presentations, you have logic based on the theory of judgment, and you have ethics based on the theory of love and hate. And Husserl in his, early on actually accepted Brentano, and his initial project in philosophy, his philosophy of arithmetic, was based on Brentano's descriptive psychology. Now, by the time that book, by the way, was published in 1891. But in the course of the 1890s, Husserl turned more and more to logic, still very much oriented in descriptive psychology, but even though he said he was doing descriptive psychology, and I think that's a good description of what he was doing, his own way of analyzing mental phenomena started diverging more and more from Brentano. Now, when Brentano said that a judgment is an acceptance or a rejection, he was actually revising an old theory of judgment, going way back to Aristotle. Namely, that a judgment is a structure that consists of subject and predicate. S is P is the structure of a judgment, according to this old view. And Brentano is saying, no, a judgment doesn't fundamentally have that structure. A judgment is actually, it has the form of S exists, A exists, whatever, however you want to put it, or does not exist. That's the fundamental structure of judgment. But what you find in Husserl's early work on judgment, and it stays throughout all of Husserl's work on judgment, is he's primarily concerned with predication. He's primarily concerned with the old structure of SSP. He does not really bother to enter into a criticism of Brentano on that point. He does criticize Brentano on certain other points. I think one important point where he does criticize Brentano's theory of judgment, it's this. Brentano maintained that presentations are foundations for all other mental acts. And so Brentano maintained that a judgment is in all cases based on a presentation. I judge that a unicorn doesn't exist. Well, in order for me to judge that, I have to have a presentation of a unicorn. And so when I judge that a unicorn doesn't exist, there's really a twofold act that is present. There's the presentation of the unicorn, and then there's the moment, the aspect of rejecting. And already early on, we see in Husserl's manuscripts that he does not think that judging is some kind of it's not a twofold structure. Ein doppeltes erlebe ich nicht. When I judge, I don't experience this twofold structure. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that Husserl is quite comfortable with the old structure of S is P, S is not P, when he's talking about judgments. Now, in the logical investigations, you get, especially in the fifth logical investigation, you get Husserl's early attempt to state a theory of judgment before the reading public. There are manuscripts that he wrote in preparation, which involved trying, like I said, trying different things. But we can see the logical investigations as a culmination point for this early theory of judgment. So what is that? What is that early theory of judgment? Well, the theory of there is a judging. That's a mental act. Fine. It has an object. But now, what kind of object is this that a judgment has? We find in the logical investigations, Husserl thinks that there's a special kind of object that a judgment has. And this is what he calls, in German, a Sachverhalt. Or in English we say state of affairs. Actually, there's another term that comes into play here for Sachverhalt. He sometimes uses it. We'll talk more about that. There's this other term is Sachlage, which is difficult to translate into English. We'll talk about that more. That becomes very important in the second phase. What is that? What is the state of affairs? Well, say I judge that the table was black, right? S is P, the table was black. I judge that the table was black. Well, the object of my judgment, according to Husserl, yes, in one sense you could say it's the table. But really, in the most important sense, it is that the table is black. That is a state of affairs. That the table is black. That such and such is the case is a Sachverhalt, a state of affairs. So a judgment always has an object of this kind, a state of affairs. But we also find in the logical investigations talk about propositions. which is, of course, very, very important for Husserl's rejection of psychologism and logic. You might know the basic story. I'll just briefly indicate it. That in a lot of the logics in the 19th century, especially later in the 19th century, what the logicians were doing were doing logic in connection with psychology. And of course, it's from what I've said about Brentano, it appears that he was doing that as well. Now there's a whole question of whether Brentano was doing something wrong with that. Husserl and Brentano had a big discussion about it. But anyway, what Husserl argued in the first volume of the Logical Investigations, it consisted of 2 volumes. In the first volume, he was saying, no, psychology or logic can't be based on psychology. That there is a pure logic which is completely free of psychology. And an enormous influence on Husserl in this regard was Bernard Bolzano, who, of course, he is or should be one of your local heroes. Yes, we find this notion of proposition, and specifically this notion, Husserl says, is inspired by Bolzano. A proposition. A proposition is true or false. Fine. Now we have 3 things going on in this early theory of judgment. We have the judging, the mental act of judging. We have the state of affairs, the object of the judgment, and we have the proposition. The proposition is not the state of affairs, and it's not the mental act of judging. It is actually something else, according to Husserl.
What is the difference?
Well, here's how it works. What is this proposition? I'll just try to basically present it here. Let us say that this is the judgment here. This line, that's a mental act right there. That's the judgment. See, there's an arrow here to show that it's intentionally directed. And it's intentionally directed at a state of affairs. Now, here we have, I'll just put proposition here. So how is that related? Well, what it is, Husserl often says it's an idea, an ideal object. It is actually related to the judgment as a species is to an individual member of the species. For example, this is black, and this is black. We have 2 instances of black here. But there is blackness. Okay? That's an idea. This black instantiates the idea of black. So does this black. And this is how the proposition is related to the judgment. The judgment is a particular that instantiates the proposition as a specific object, eine spezifische Einheit is what Husserl often says. So the proposition is related to the judgment as redness, or as redness. I said blackness. We can also say blackness, redness. As blackness is related to instances of black, particular instances of black, or as redness is related to particular instances of red. So this is basically the theory of judgment that Husserl presents in the framework of his early phenomenology, his descriptive psychology. So are there any questions?
I have is there some hierarchy of this general narrative? For example, I can talk about black tableness, which is
of course.
subordinate to blackness and superordinate to judgment that this table is black.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's the old notion of an order of genera and species. But I think that the proposition, as he envisions it, is like it would be the lowest species.
Uh-huh.
Because you could keep going up, and you could say, for example, take the Pythagorean theorem. You could formulate that, and you could say, okay, but there's a higher genus, which would be geometrical propositions, and you can keep going up and up till you just get propositions. But I take it when he talks about a proposition, what he's normally talking about is the lowest species, and the next thing down would be the particular judgment.
Please, now proposition, as I understand now, is some true value.
Yes, the proposition. Yes.
What is the Husserl's connection? This proposition.
Yes, the proposition is a bearer of truth. And propositions, according to this early theory, are bearers of truth or bearers of falsehood. It's not the judgment primarily that's true or false. It is the proposition that's true or false. And this is connected, of course, with his critique of psychologism. And what logic, pure logic, is talking about is not judgments, not mental acts, but it's talking about propositions. So that's
So the judgment is so the judgment is always individual act. It's not possible to say that if we have, for example, 1 + 1 is 2, and then that is true. That is not a judgment. It's the proposition. Or am I?
When sometimes, of course, Husserl knows that language is ambiguous. There's a lot of ambiguity in language, a lot of equivocation. And sometimes when we're talking about the judgment, we really mean the proposition. So we could say the judgment that 2 + 2 = 4 or something like that. But when we talk that way, when we say the judgment, we're not normally talking about this particular act of judging. We're talking about the proposition. Yes?
Somehow I cannot develop my personal feeling to the word of proposition. Would you mention in another example what you mentioned false and truth? That's what I feel that I understand. Could you develop some other attribute to this proposition? Example.
Well, you know, like I said, it's not a particular thing in the world. It does not come into being and pass away. It is a timeless, it exists timelessly. I think the most important aspect of propositions, if you ask me to say more about them rather than, okay, they're true or false, they're timeless, they're related to each other in logical ways. One proposition can follow from another one. They can be inconsistent with each other. The table is black, the table is not black. I mean, a false proposition is a proposition. Propositions are truth bearers. Now, states of affairs are not really truth bearers. You always have to read carefully. Sometimes you'll find Husserl talking about a Sachverhalt being true. It does happen in the first edition of the Logical Investigations, but you also find in the second edition that he changes that to ein Sachverhalt besteht, exists. A state of affairs is what makes a proposition true. So the table is black, that's a true proposition, and what makes it true is the state of affairs that the table is black.
Sorry, but how
Yes?
is that timeless then? Because the table is black now, maybe it won't be black 10 years from now, but you said that the proposition was timeless.
Oh, well, you know, there are indexicals built into our language, and if you wanted to formulate the proposition, you have to take that into. You mean, do you mean, for example, I say the table is black, and then somebody paints the table?
Or it wears away because it's old, and so that the
Exactly, and then I say the table is black. Well, it's not true. So it was true, and then it's not true. But then there are different propositions. When I'm saying the table is black, I mean the table is black now.
But you were saying that the proposition is the timeless, you were saying that a proposition is timeless, and so, and I understand it works for something like 2 + 2 = 4. But then you said that the proposition is true or false depending on the state of affairs, and the state of affairs is not timeless. And that's what I'm not understanding, is which one.
Oh, well, you know, propositions are not necessarily mathematical, or they're timeless. They are timeless, but that doesn't mean that they can't contain some kind of reference to time. So the proposition, the table is black now, it's a timeless proposition. But if you formulate it in language, of course, you'll need to use the indexical now. I don't see conflict between those two things. The proposition itself is timeless, but it can have a reference to time.
I don't understand how that's timeless, but that's okay. You can just maybe I can understand further.
I think it could be useful to point to the origin of this idea in Bolzano. You mentioned Bolzano, and so this is the heritage of Sätze an sich. So a proposition is Satz an sich from Brentano's Wissenschaftslehre, and exactly those characteristics, features of propositions you mentioned now. This is the list of what Brentano has, Bolzano has in Wissenschaftslehre. So this concept of time independence of Sätze an sich is something with this Bolzanian heritage in Husserl. And he developed it during his further development.
Yes. And Husserl gives Bolzano a lot of credit for developing this notion of a proposition. Satz, Husserl often just says Ersatz. He doesn't say Ersatz, but he's quite clear that he's inspired by Bolzano. And Bolzano has the same really treats things in the same way. He thinks that a proposition is timeless, but it can still have a reference to temporal events in the world. Now, maybe some people can't live with that. But anyway, that's what Husserl thought at this point. He thinks that Bolzano is not precise enough. I mean, when Husserl is inspired by a philosopher, he's always going to say, but, you know, some revisions have to be made. I mean, he said that Bolzano did not get this relation here. He doesn't fully understand this whole schema. He doesn't distinguish between states of affairs and propositions. He doesn't quite understand that a proposition is an idea, a specific entity for which the judgment instantiates. He says there's a hint in Bolzano at such ideas, but he doesn't develop it. So that's Husserl's first theory of judgment. Now, he after he published the logical investigations, he continued. Of course, he continued lecturing and writing his manuscripts, and for quite a while he was happy with this schema. But by the time around 1908 or so, he started developing new ideas for his theory of judgment. Yes?
Is there some relationship with Frege?
You know, is there? He asks if there's a relationship with Frege, and of course, you know, conceptually there seems to be, right? But I don't think Husserl was deeply inspired by Frege. I don't think that's the case. I mean, he refers to Frege in passing, but I think that Bolzano is much more important. But if we look at the ideas systematically, you know, we can make all kinds of you can see all kinds of interesting parallels and comparisons. Good. Well, right around 1908, Husserl gave a lecture on the theory of meaning, Bedeutungslehre, and that lecture was given in the same year that Anton Marti published his Untersuchungen zur Grundlegung der allgemeinen Grammatik und Sprachphilosophie, and I think that Husserl was to some extent under the influence of Marti, or responding to Marti. And I think that in 1908 he wanted to give a Bedeutungslehre because Marti had given his Bedeutungslehre. And he had to show, well, I have one too. And this is another point. Okay, I'm reminded of another point. What does that have to do with the theory of judgment? Bedeutungslehre. Okay, that's a good question. I want to back up a moment. This gentleman asked me, what are some characteristics of a proposition? They're true or false. They're timeless. They're instantiated by particular judgments. They enter into logical relations. Well, here's another. I have another. They are Bedeutungen. They are meanings. There is one other thing that we can add to the schema here. There's one other thing. And there's a German word here, Aussage. Aussage. And so we get we get another relation here. We'll call that in English, we'll call that a statement. And that is the expression of the judgment, the expression in language. The statement is the linguistic expression of the judgment. This is where Husserl talks about a Kundgabe or a Kundgebung, a manifestation. The statement manifests the judgment. If I say the table is black, I manifest to you my mental act of judging that the table is black. Okay, now, what is the meaning of the statement? Is the meaning the judgment? It can't be the judgment. The statement, the table is black, for example, has one meaning. If the meaning is the judgment, well, I make my judgment, you make your judgment, and so forth, and there are many judgments. But there's only one meaning. Is it the state of affairs? No, it's not the state of affairs, because the state of affairs is the object. Here, Frege, you can make comparisons with Frege. It's, in the Fregean theory, it is the reference. The state of affairs would be the reference. And in some instances, say that I judge that there's a unicorn in this room. There is no such state of affairs. There is no unicorn in this room. So it's even possible for there to be no state of affairs. But a statement still has meaning. If I say there's a unicorn in this room, that statement still has a meaning. It doesn't have an object, but it still has a meaning. And voila, here's the meaning. The proposition is the meaning of a statement. So, in 1908, he wanted to elaborate on this theory of meaning. But he revised it. He revised it. And he said that, yes, it's okay. You can say the proposition is the meaning of the statement. But there's also another meaning of meaning. And what is that? Well, that is the correlate of, in this instance, we're talking about the judgment. That is a correlate of the judgment. Now, when we talk about a correlate, we're, of course, going back to Aristotelian terminology. For example, slave master. Those are correlates of each other. When we talk about correlates, if one of them exists, the other one has to exist. The state of affairs is not the correlate of the judgment, because it's possible for the state of affairs not to exist. Okay, but Husserl says that even if I judge something false, there is an objective correlate of that judgment. It's not the proposition. There's an objective correlate, and that is also to be regarded as the meaning of the judgment. Meaning can have two meanings. It can mean, in the case of a statement, it can mean the proposition, but it can also mean the correlate of the judgment. He also talks about this correlate as in the case of judgment, as das Geurteilte als solches. When I'm thinking about, when I'm making a false judgment, for example, what I'm thinking about is not the proposition. And I'm not thinking about it. I'm actually thinking about the correlate of my judgment. In the terms of the ideas, this correlate is the noema. The noema, in contrast with what Husserl calls the Gegenstand schlechthin. I told you a long time ago that there is this Sachlage here. And what he does with these terms is he refines the meaning in this in 1908 and continuing on through the years, and he starts using Sachverhalt actually as the term for the correlate of a judgment, and he uses Sachlage to designate the Gegenstand schlechthin of the judgment. An example. A, B. Okay. I can judge, for example, that A is to the left of B. But I can also judge that B is to the left of A. Okay, now, Husserl says that in this case, okay, there's a statement, but there are two meanings. These terms don't mean, these statements, A is to the left of B and B is to the right of A. Did I make a mistake?
Yeah.
Okay. A is to the left of B and B is to the right of A. Okay. And I'm on tape here. This could be a great embarrassment. Okay. A is to the left of B and B is to the right of A. Here we have two different statements. They have different meanings, says Husserl. They have different meanings, but they're about the same thing. They're about the same Sachlage. Here we have just really one Sachlage. In English, that's sometimes translated as situation. We have one situation, but there are two different correlates of the judgment. I mean, there are two different judgments, really, and each one has a different correlate. Is the right way to formulate it. A is to the left of B, and B is to the right of A.
These two propositions are equivalent.
Yes?
In this case, what is the proposition?
There are two propositions.
two prepositions?
There are two propositions, yes, but there are also two correlates.
Yeah, but then it is not clear what's the two meanings of meaning. You said there are two different meanings of meaning. First was the preposition.
Well, I'm saying that oh yeah, sure. I mean,
What's the difference then?
here you would have two different propositions, but you'd also have two different correlates.
Well, but
That's the other meaning of meaning, the correlate.
But it means the same.
When I ask you, no, that doesn't mean the same. If I ask you to tell me what you mean, you're not thinking of some kind of universal. You're thinking of what I mean. That's the correlate.
That's fine, but then you say it's two prepositions, so then I don't see the difference between preposition and the correlate.
It's the noetic noematic distinction. The noetic noematic distinction is key to.
Well, that's it. I mean, it doesn't only apply to judgment. The noesis distinction applies throughout the whole realm of mental acts. Every mental act, according to this theory that Husserl was developing in 1908 and continued to develop, every mental act has a correlate. A perception has a correlate.
That's clear, but you wanted to say that, or Husserl wanted to say that there are two meanings of meaning. And I don't see the difference between those two, because you said, well, there are two correlates of the statement about A is next to the left.
So there are two Sachverhalte and one Sachlage.
And you said there are also two propositions, so what's the difference between the two meanings of meaning? You just describe it in another way, but you describe it as to be the same.
Then I think another way has to be found to describe it. Husserl keeps saying that when you're talking about the correlate, you're reflecting. It's a kind of reflection. You don't reflect on propositions. The correlate is immanent in the act. The proposition is really something transcendent. Do you want?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in these lectures on the theory of meaning, so basically he really gives the model from the logical investigation, which is that the proposition is sort of ideal structure of the act. It is a noetic meaning. It is a noetic model or concept of meaning, because it is derived from the structure of the act. And then we have the noematic meaning, which is the correlate of the act. And so in this case, there is one situation, one Sachlage, and we have two different meanings, and both those two different meanings are different as noetic and as noematic as well. So you have noetic and noematic concept of meaning in these lectures, and that's the thing. So there is the parallelism between the noetic and noematic meaning structure, and I think that's the development from the logical investigation, and that's the way how he tries to leave actually this original model as something which is unuseful, because it's too focused on the act structure.
Right. He's working in this descriptive psychological phase. He's working in the sphere of acts. I mean, the judgment should reflect the proposition should actually reflect the judgment. It's all on the plane of acts. It's a purely, in his later terminology, a noetic description. He talks about a state of affairs, but that needn't exist. That needn't exist at all. You're not satisfied.
Well, I'm rather satisfied with what people say.
Ah, very good. Very good. Well, he's written extensively about this. Oh yeah. Good. Okay, so that's the second phase. What are we doing in terms of time?
I think it's okay. We still have 1 hour, so
Okay, but
plenty of time and a discussion as well. So
I'm not going to be very. I'm not going to go into the third phase at great length because I think that there could well be people here that know more about it than I do. But I think for the sake, at least I'm providing. I'm trying to provide some kind of framework. Oh yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to say a little bit about the addition I did and what that has to do with this, the Husserliana 40. That actually, that consists primarily of manuscripts that Husserl had been writing from about 1908. And in 1918, he asked his assistant, Edith Stein, to gather this material together. And those manuscripts are called the U-Blätter. And so it makes it clear to you that Husserl was very much interested in the theory of judgment, and he intended to publish something at great length about it. But he was never satisfied with his older theories. He kept thinking that, well, a new one has to be developed. New dimensions of the whole problem have to be explored. And finally, there was another set of manuscripts, and they were collected together by his assistant Ludwig Landgrave. And we have a publication from that. We have Erfahrung und Urteil. Now this is genetic phenomenology. This last phase. This is what Husserl called genetic phenomenology. This phase that we just discussed, which was about noesis and noema, that was still static phenomenology. It does not take into account development. Genetic phenomenology is about development. And this notion of a genetic phenomenology was already developing in the 1920s when Husserl was giving lectures in Freiburg. He was in Freiburg at that time giving lectures on passive synthesis, active synthesis. He did not call the lectures that. He had various titles for them. I think in his initial lecture on passive and active synthesis, it's just called logic. There are 2 volumes in the Husserliana, one on passive synthesis and one on active synthesis, but they should really be together. And the English translations are put together, which is very good. And so the basic idea here in this final phase, and I'm not going to go into that at length. If somebody knows a lot about it, well, we can talk about it. But it was that there is a judgment is a kind of synthesis. Okay, S is P involves some kind of synthesis. But this is an active synthesis. The active synthesis develops out of a passive synthesis, which occurs in perception. And what he's doing in this final phase is he's exploring how judgment develops out of perception. So we say, for example, we've had the example of the table is black. And, before I even make that judgment, I see the table, I turn my attention to its blackness. There are various acts of passive synthesis that go on, like association, abstraction, and the judgment develops out of that. Now, like I said, I don't want to really go into this, but this is Husserl thought this was extremely important for his philosophy of logic. The project was designated as a genealogy of logic. He also states the program for doing this in the formal and transcendental logic. Of course, the project was not completed, but we do have the Erfahrung und Urteil. Not all of the manuscripts have been traced back to the original, and therefore we don't know completely whether we're just getting certain ideas from the editor, Landgrave, but of course it's an extremely interesting project. Landgrave, by the way, did his Habilitation in Prague. That book was published in Prague. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say by way of lecture, and I'm ready for discussion.
So, thank you. The discussion is open. Please feel free.
Perhaps you still could say something more what Husserl means by development of logic. It sounds very strange.
It sounds very strange. Well, the development of judgment, actually. The genealogy of logic. It does sound very strange. And
What does it mean?
there's an original sense. There's an original sense of logic. There's this, of course, this is also related to his Husserl's crisis and his various manuscripts, like the one on the origin of geometry. But the idea here is that there's an original sense of logic that can get lost. He actually thinks that the original sense of logic and even science has somehow gotten lost. And the way to overcome this crisis, he says, there is in the sciences and also in logic, is to reflect back to this original sense. But that's not satisfactory for you, perhaps.
Because in the beginning you said correctly that logic is something timeless and not depending on psychology and so on.
Yeah, it's not psychology.
No, but where is the development then?
Oh, it's not, the propositions don't develop, but our judgments develop.
But the logic, you said, you still spoke about the development of logic.
Logic is still logic is a discipline. Logic is a praxis, a human praxis, and that does develop.
Okay, well, it's a discipline.
But in his genealogy of logic, he's not just doing a history of logic, not just reporting facts.
No, but when you say genealogy of logic, he apparently doesn't mean the history of the discipline. Or does he?
I would say yes. I think he's not talking about the development of propositions, or he's not talking about the development of truths. He's talking about a development of how we come to the truths. But it's not it's not just a historical reporting. It's all in the sphere of, well, I didn't talk much about this, of eidetic inquiry. It is supposed to deliver us certain essential truths. Yes. That's what later Husserl is about. This idea that you can actually describe developments and have and have insights into how they must essentially develop, how they must come about. Now, various people have various takes on this project. Some people are very, very sympathetic to it. Did you do much work on that? You were mainly fixed on this second phase.
No, the first one.
The first one, okay.
And the transition from the first to the second.
Yes, up to 1908.
14.
1940, yeah. Yeah, and then, and when the First World War started, he said he couldn't think about these things any longer. Yeah.
So in this third stage, he doesn't use this structural statement, judgment, proposition at all? Or?
It's very difficult because he doesn't seem to make use of it. But it's not completely absent either. I just a short time ago, I searched through the formal and transcendental logic for noema, and it only occurs a few times.
Oh, excuse me. Maybe I'm the only one. I don't understand noema. Noesis, noema. Who do you mention? What is the intent? What do you mean?
The noesis is the act.
Noesis is the act.
The noesis is the act. The noema is the correlate of the act. Yes, the noesis, the noema is the objective correlate of the act. The noema is what the act is about, or what the act is aimed at.
I recently heard some women name. This is probably Noemi or something.
I don't know anything about this. Oh, Naomi.
Naomi.
It has nothing to do with Naomi.
Just another question. If there is, I just wonder, Robin, is there any influence from the members of the school of Brentano on this Husserlian move from the static to the genetic part of his theory of judgment? So, for example, you mentioned this reaction to Anton Marty's philosophy of language in 1908. So, do you think is there any influence, let's say, a discussion with some of those members?
That's a very, very good question. And I can't give you a very good answer, but I mean that space of inquiry was pretty well left open. A whole genetic area of inquiry was left open in the School of Brentano. Now, there are some things in manuscripts, but what Husserl knew, no, I would say he was not. I think he was inspired, prompted towards in various directions from members of the School of Brentano. I think Marty prompted him to move in this direction in the second phase with correlates, and even in the domain of values. Marty uses this interesting term Wertverhalt, not a Sachverhalt, but a Wertverhalt, which is the correlate of acts of love and hate. And Marty says this opens up a whole domain of objective values. And I think Husserl was very much inspired by that, but I can't find anything definite about how he was inspired towards, to move in this direction of genetic phenomenology. But there could very well be bits and pieces. A lot of this genetic, a lot of what we find in Erfahrung und Urteil reflects a lot of psychology that had been done, that was done in the by Husserl's predecessors. Husserl thematizes association and all kinds of psychological concepts, and of course the members of the School of Brentano had a lot to say about these things too. So in that respect,
Yeah,
I mean,
was thinking about this part of.
yes, it's very well possible. It's very well possible. It's very hard to say where Husserl got these ideas. But he's always saying, when he displays them, yeah, there was a Vermutung or whatever among his predecessors. The previous psychologists, they were describing things that should be described, and they even going back to Hume, very important figure for Husserl. But Husserl is always saying, but they did not properly understand it.
Maybe I would have one general question about editing and publishing the manuscripts. It's quite interesting because as you said, and you know that they were not meant to be published. Now they are integral parts of Husserl's work. So how was it at the beginning of publishing these manuscripts? Who exactly decided that they will be published and how?
Well, Husserl, of course, he was always planning things and wanted to develop certain works out of these manuscripts, like the lectures on time consciousness. That's one product that was actually realized in his life. That's the kind of thing he wanted to do with his manuscripts. Edith Stein took his lecture from 1905 on time consciousness, also various other manuscripts, organized them. Husserl read over the materials, you know, and he had his own ideas about how they were to be organized. But it's amazing how much he really left in the hands of his assistants. And later, what he was doing with Landgräbe, with Erfahrung und Urteil, that was published after Husserl's death, but Husserl really did plan to publish that. And so that was what he planned to do, but by the time he was really old, he realized it could not be done. But he and his close followers, of course his assistants, Landgräbe and Fink, thought that this material had to be preserved, and I suppose, you know, ultimately published. And so that was the mission of the Husserl archives. I mean, that was, well, actually the person behind it all was von Breda, who of course courageously rescued these manuscripts from Nazi Germany, brought them into Belgium, hid them during the war. After the war, the idea was von Breda was to start publishing these manuscripts. So the war ended in 1945. The first volume of the Husserliana was the Cartesianische Meditationen of 1950, the Cartesian Meditations. There's an interesting story behind that. Why did they start with that particular volume? Well, because they thought that it would be an interest in Husserl in France. Merleau-Ponty had come to the Husserl archives already in the 40s. And of course, Sartre was inspired by Husserl, so they really thought that, well, at least we'll have a readership in France. Because after the war, Husserl was not a big deal. You know, I mean, a lot of traditions have been broken in Europe because of the wars. The whole school of Brentano got interrupted. And here we have an instance of one man with a mission, von Breda, to publish this material. And it started getting some reception, you know, already in the 50s. I think it makes the interpretation. You can argue, well, has it really given us insights, or has it made our life more problematic? Because it's like I said, it's very difficult to interpret these things. If I'm reading a secondary literature on Husserl and they say, well, Husserl says this, and they quote from a manuscript. He says this at some time in some context, you know. You have to be very, very, very careful about that. On the other hand, what you get in his published works, I find, are often really ad hoc solutions. Well, it's this way and that way. The pure ego and the ideas. He says, well, is that immanent? Yeah, it's immanent, but in some way it's transcendent, so it's a transcendence in immanence. And I don't think that's satisfactory. Another instance, I told you that the noema is immanent. The noema is immanent in the act. It's the objective correlate. But when we reflect, we can reflect on the noema, not only on our acts, but on the noema. I can ask, what do I really mean? And then I'm reflecting on the correlate. Good, it's immanent. I mean, I don't have to go out and look around for something. It's immanent in consciousness. Okay. But a lot of other things are immanent in consciousness too. Not only acts, not only the correlates, but also what Husserl calls Hülle in the ideas, which includes at least sensations. They're also in consciousness, and they're not acts, they're not correlates of acts. So you get this, you get all kinds of things that are immanent in the act, but Husserl says, yeah, but the noema, it's immanent in a very special way. It's intentionally immanent. And the sensations, they're réels. They're really immanent. It's very difficult to translate that into English, but it seems to me something of an ad hoc solution. He's coming up with terminology. It's a verbal solution. It seems to be a verbal solution, and I find that often in Husserl's published writings, where when you look into these manuscripts, you see that he does not settle matters so easily.
What part of this manuscript is not published yet? This is a big
Oh, it's almost all published.
Almost all
There's a small amount that's not published. There's the Studien zur Struktur des Bewusstseins should be published pretty soon. Another version of Ideen 2, the second volume of the ideas, is going to be published soon. The Grenzprobleme, which has a lot to do with Husserl's own personal worldview, is going to be published soon. There's some older things that I would like to see published, because I'm very much interested in the older things. So I did what I could to publish old materials on the theory of judgment, which I think really enhances the picture. I think that from what I've seen of recent publications of this material, the publication of the older things is more interesting because it's different. It's different. The 1896 lectures on logic, I found to be a very interesting publication. But yeah, it's winding down. You won't see a lot more volumes from Husserl's manuscripts.
Yeah. Okay. So, are there any other questions, comments?
Maybe a small invitation. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Robin will give us a lecture on Marxist philosophy of language in our seminar at the Institute of Philosophy, which will be at the meeting room at the Institute. So you're really welcome to attend it. And so it will start at 10 and run probably till 12. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you. So, and one more, thank you.